I remember the exact moment I stopped being the kind of woman who cried quietly into her pillow. It was late autumn, the light in the living room thin and silver, when I found the message. It wasn't dramatic, no incriminating photos or a confession in plain sight, just a line of text on a tablet that had been left unlocked. Can you meet tonight? I need to talk about the arrangements. It was signed with a name I did not recognize. For a second I sat there and let the world blur, imagining explanations that softened the blow. Work stress, a business associate, anything that made the sting manageable. But then I noticed the little things I had shoved into the back of my mind for years. The late returns from supposed team dinners, the receipts for hotels in other cities, the sudden weekend getaways he'd call team building. The pattern sharpened like a pencil tip. He had been living two lives. On instinct I did what I always did when I wanted answers. I watched. Not with the frenzied panic of someone searching for ammunition, but with the calculated patience of someone who had learned a lesson the hard way. That emotion without preparation makes you vulnerable. He was my ex, yes, but we still shared history, a house, a routine woven with small predictable threads. That familiarity, once comforting, had become my advantage. The first week after the message I let him believe nothing had changed. I smiled when he told me about work. I packed his travel mug and asked about his meetings as if I expected a detailed answer. He relaxed into old habits. He thought I'd crumble, that tears would be my answer. He thought I'd let him stir the pot of accusations until they drowned me. He thought wrong. My plan began almost quietly. I started with things no one would call dramatic. I backed up our shared files to a secure drive in my maiden name. I created a separate email I used to request information from vendors listed on receipts I'd found, and I opened a savings account that he did not know about. Practicalities felt oddly powerful. Each small, deliberate action was a step away from helplessness and toward control. I called Mara, my sister, and told her a minimized version of the truth, the parts that would make her alert without sending her into a panic. She arrived that evening with a casserole and a calm that steadied me. We sat at the kitchen table while the house hummed with the actors of our old life moving in rehearsed patterns. Mara listened and nodded, her eyes sharp. You don't have to cry, she said. You can plan. You can win. That sentence lodged in me like a seed in fertile soil. Win. The idea shifted everything from victimhood to strategy. I reached out to someone I trusted. An old friend, Theo, who worked in corporate compliance. He owed me favors from a time when I'd helped him navigate a thorny personnel issue at his firm. When I explained, carefully, the pattern I'd seen, the hotel receipts, the weekend trips, the unfamiliar names, his expression shifted from sympathy to methodical interest. You don't confront him without proof, he advised. You need paper trails, timestamps, bank transfers, material that a court takes seriously, or that will force him to reveal what he's hiding. He didn't lecture, he gave me a checklist. The shift from emotion to evidence felt like armor. Night after night I pieced together a dossier. I cataloged receipts like a librarian indexing rare books. Date, vendor, time, and any stray detail that stuck out. I cross-referenced credit card statements with his calendar invites and found holes where client dinners had become late-night hotel bookings. I set up a discrete folder in the cloud and labeled everything with a meticulousness I had never known I possessed. On the 10th night, a key detail appeared. A pattern of transfers from a corporate expense account to a business I couldn't find online. A small antiques dealer with a P.O. box and a passive voicemail. It was the kind of thing people used when they wanted movement that left no obvious footprints. The hairs on my arms rose. I had never thought of him as someone smart enough to design schemes, only slippery enough to hide behind excuses. Now the evidence suggested deliberation. I hired an investigator with cash I'd been saving. Not a vengeful private eye cliché, but a professional, discreet, and expensive for a reason. His name was Luis, a man who carried an old-school briefcase in a city that had nearly abandoned paper. He met with me in a diner and, after a long, careful look at the files I'd compiled, smiled in a way that signaled competence rather than triumph. We move quietly, he said. We trace accounts, confirm identities, and if there's an offshore connection, we flag it to counsel for legal action. You don't want headlines, you want remedy. Remedy. Another small, steady word that shaped my strategy. I had no interest in tearing down a life for spectacle. I wanted security for myself and my future. And I wanted the truth unmasked in a way that left no room for his easy dismissals. Luis's involvement changed the tempo. Within days he produced evidence the ledger hadn't shown. Emails to an address that matched the antiques dealer, photographs of packages leaving in the dead of night, and a receipt from a storage facility 3 towns over. The image that had once been fogged with suspicion sharpened into a map. The man I had loved had been making choices that used our marriage as camouflage. There was a crushing moment, too. A receipt for a hotel dated on the day of our anniversary. My hand closed around the paper like a fist. Memories of past tenderness collided with raw betrayal. I lay awake that night thinking about the way grief and anger braided together. But underneath both emotions was a stronger, quieter current. A clarity about what I would do next. I consulted an attorney who specialized in family law and financial litigation. Her name was Denise, and she had a reputation for being temperate in court but relentless in preparation. She told me that the path forward would require patience, documentation, and an understanding that exposing someone can be a slow machine of truth. You'll want to move fast, but you must move right, she said. If you rush and he hides assets, you'll lose more. The legal framing reassured me. It was less romantic than a scene of dramatic confrontation, but it was more effective. Denise helped me draft a plan. File for temporary protective orders on joint accounts, serve a notice of intent to seek full financial disclosure, and prepare for discovery requests that would force transparency. She emphasized safety. If he acted out, we'd have restraint mechanisms in place. We didn't build a dramatic trap. I refused the temptation to create viral humiliation. Instead, we created a shield. My actions were precise. Open an account in my name, secure key documents and backups, and coordinate with Luis to verify every suspicious transaction. At night I would sit with a cup of tea and stare at the pile of papers on my table, feeling the strange empowerment of someone who had moved from being surprised by life to directing it. As the weeks unfolded, small victories accumulated. A bank froze an account temporarily after Denise filed a motion. A subpoena nudged a vendor into revealing invoices that matched my suspicions. Luis's photos placed my ex in locations he'd claimed were work-related. Each confirmation was a bright light piercing the fog. He noticed the change, of course, but not necessarily for the reasons I expected. He saw my calm steadiness and misread it as resignation. One evening he sat across from me at the kitchen table, eyes tired, and said, with a smirk that used to charm me, "You really think you can make a life without me? That you won't be lost." He sounded certain I would crumble, and that my tears would be the currency of my defeat. I looked at him and for the first time in a long while, felt nothing toward him that resembled need. I replied simply, "I don't want a life without you. I want a life without your secrets." My words were soft but edged with a conviction he couldn't buy back. He laughed then, a brittle sound. "You'll cry and beg, you know. Women always do." That sentence, more than any receipt or late-night text, ignited a part of me I had kept quiet. He had expected tears, instead he got planning. He had expected weakness, instead he met resolve. I could have unfolded every paper I had gathered and hurled it across the table. I could have screamed the truth in his face and let the noise be the outcome. Instead, I closed the file slowly, stood up and walked out of the kitchen. That night I sat in my car at a distance, watching our house through the rain-smeared windshield while Lily slept inside, oblivious. I thought about what it would feel like if I let myself unravel in front of him. The pity, the whispering, the eventual erasure of my own story by his version. I had something better planned than tears. I had a life to reclaim, and I was going to take it back carefully, with witnesses, evidence, and a strategy that left no room for his smug denials. The following days carried a strange calmness. On the outside, everything looked normal. The house still echoed with the hum of appliances, the shuffle of daily routines, and the occasional laughter from our daughter, Lily. But beneath that calm was a storm that only I could see. I was no longer just a woman piecing together fragments of betrayal. I was the architect of my own future. I started rising earlier than usual. At 5:30 in the morning, before anyone else stirred, I would sit at the dining room table with a notepad and pen, mapping out every move. Coffee steaming in my cup, I wrote lists like a general preparing for war. Documents I needed to copy, numbers I had to call, accounts I had to monitor, and names of people who could serve as allies. Every morning ritual made me stronger. The woman who once drowned in tears had dried her eyes and sharpened her instincts. I learned quickly that secrecy was my shield. If he had even an ounce of suspicion that I was building a case against him, he might bury his tracks deeper, move money faster, or manipulate me into doubt again. So I smiled when he came down for breakfast, placing toast and eggs in front of him like it was just another day. He talked casually about projects at work, about trips he had to make, about colleagues who needed him. I nodded, offered polite questions, and hid the storm churning inside. He believed the facade because he wanted to. He always believed in my silence. Meanwhile, Mara became my quiet confidant. We talked late into the night on the phone when the house was still. She reminded me constantly, "You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. You're uncovering the truth." Her unwavering belief in me steadied my resolve, especially when the evidence grew uglier. There were moments when I would stare at receipts or emails and feel bile rise in my throat. But each time despair threatened to return, Mara's words anchored me. One night, Luis, the investigator, called with a development. "I think you should see this," he said, his voice steady but laced with importance. We met again in the same diner, the smell of fried food and coffee grounding me as he laid out photographs across the table. There he was, my husband, the man who still shared my bed, standing outside a small storage facility with another woman. She looked mid-30s, dressed in a simple trench coat, her hand resting casually on his arm as though they were partners in crime. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to study the details instead of drowning in emotion. Luis pointed to the lock on the storage unit. "We believe he's been moving assets, possibly antiques, maybe cash equivalents. We'll verify soon." I picked up one of the photographs. The angle caught his face mid-conversation. His expression relaxed, almost smug. That was the part that stung the most. Not just the betrayal, but the confidence with which he lived it, as though he'd already won some twisted game. When I got home that night, I found him sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone with a beer in hand. He looked up and grinned. "You're late. Out with Mara again?" His tone was teasing light. He had no idea. "Yes," I replied evenly, slipping off my coat. "We had things to talk about." He smirked, returning to his phone. "I'm glad you're keeping busy." The irony of his words almost made me laugh. Busy indeed. The next morning I met with Denise, the attorney. Her office smelled faintly of leather and old books, the kind of space that radiated quiet authority. I laid out the photographs, the receipts, the records I'd compiled. She examined each piece with a deliberate calm, occasionally jotting down notes. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious but approving. "You've done half my work already," she said. "This isn't just suspicion. It's a pattern. A deliberate effort to deceive and hide. With this we can build a strong case. But," she paused, folding her hands together, "you need to prepare yourself. Men like him, who believe they hold all the power, rarely go down quietly. He will lash out, manipulate, maybe even try to intimidate you into silence." I nodded, the warning settling in my bones. I'm not afraid of his anger anymore. I've lived with it in silence long enough. Now he can live with the truth. That night, lying in bed beside him, I felt the strangeness of dual realities. His steady breathing filled the room. The man who once whispered promises now sleeping like a stranger. And me lying still awake, rehearsing the next steps in my mind. I could feel the distance growing between us. An invisible wall built out of secrets, lies, and the quiet strength I had reclaimed. The following week, Luis uncovered another key piece. The antiques dealer, the one with the P.O. box, was nothing more than a shell company. The business was fake, used to funnel money elsewhere. Denise explained that this discovery opened the door to possible fraud charges, not just marital misconduct. What he thought was clever, almost invisible, had left a trail wide enough for us to follow. I began to see everything differently. His smirks, his excuses, his little jabs about my sensitivity. They were the crutches of a man convinced he could lie forever. And I realized, with a surge of unexpected clarity, that my tears had been his shield. My silence had been his best tool. But now both were gone. The more evidence I gathered, the stronger I felt. I started dressing differently, not for him but for myself. Blazers instead of cardigans, heels instead of flats. I wanted to look in the mirror and see a woman who could walk into a courtroom without flinching. A woman who no longer bowed under betrayal. Even Lily noticed. "Mom, you look confident," she said one morning, her young eyes wide with admiration. That one word filled me with a pride deeper than any victory over my ex could ever give me. But my ex noticed too. One evening he tilted his head and asked, "What's gotten into you lately? You've been different." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm just remembering who I am." He chuckled, clearly amused by what he thought was a phase. "Well, don't get too used to it. Life's not easy without me." The arrogance in his tone no longer made me angry. It only confirmed what I already knew. He had no idea what storm was coming. By the time another month passed, the lines of my life were clearly drawn. On the surface, I was still the accommodating wife, smiling at dinner, nodding when he rambled about work, even laughing at jokes I'd heard 100 times. But underneath, I was building a fortress of truth. Luis continued his quiet surveillance, slipping me updates with the efficiency of a surgeon. Each new detail added weight to the case we were assembling. One night he handed me a file that contained photos of my ex meeting the same woman again, this time in a cafe outside town. They sat across from each other, their heads close, a laptop between them. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid of being seen. He, on the other hand, looked entirely at ease, as though he owned the world. When I asked Luis what he thought, he didn't hesitate. "She's not just a mistress. She's involved. This looks like partnership." Partnership. The word sliced deeper than betrayal alone. This wasn't just infidelity, it was collusion. I took the file to Denise, who leaned back in her chair after reviewing the photos. "This is significant," she said. "If she's part of the operation, we can subpoena her as well. People like her usually crumble under legal pressure. She may even testify to protect herself." The thought of my ex's carefully hidden world unraveling piece by piece was intoxicating. Not because I wanted revenge for its own sake, but because for once he wouldn't control the narrative. He wouldn't paint me as the fragile wife who couldn't handle the truth. The truth was mine now, and it was heavy enough to crush his lies. At home, his arrogance grew bolder. He returned later and later, brushing off my questions with thin excuses. Sometimes he'd accuse me of being too suspicious or overly emotional, as if gaslighting me could still work. But instead of tears, he met silence. Instead of pleading, he saw my calm eyes and faint smile. He didn't know what to make of it. He mistook composure for weakness, never realizing it was the mask of preparation. One evening, as he headed for the door with an overnight bag, he smirked. "Don't wait up." "I won't," I replied softly, without looking up from the book I was reading. That simple response unsettled him. He paused, watching me, as though trying to decode a new language I had begun speaking. But then he shrugged and left, confident that I was still the same woman who once cried herself to sleep. What he didn't know was that Denise and I had already filed motions that week. Requests for discovery, financial disclosure, and temporary protective orders. Within days, he would receive official notice that his world was shifting, whether he wanted it to or not. The morning the papers were served, he stormed into the kitchen, his face red with fury. Slamming the documents onto the counter, he shouted, "What the hell is this? Are you insane?" I looked at him steadily, refusing to flinch. "It's a request for transparency. Something you've been avoiding for years." His jaw tightened, his voice rising. "You think you can humiliate me? You think you can dig into my business and not pay for it?" "I'm not humiliating you," I said calmly. "I'm protecting myself. And Lily. From your lies." He glared at me, his chest heaving. For a moment I thought he might strike me. But then he laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You'll regret this. You'll be nothing without me." "Then why are you so afraid of the truth?" I asked softly. That question stopped him. For the first time I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He muttered something under his breath, grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house. The silence he left behind was profound. I stood in the kitchen, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the release of years of suppression. I wasn't the crying wife anymore. I was the woman who had taken back her voice. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings, depositions, and strategy sessions. Denise was relentless, filing motion after motion that forced him to hand over documents, account statements, and communication records. Each paper trail was another nail in the coffin of his deception. Luis's findings were equally damning. He uncovered evidence of offshore accounts linked to shell companies, storage units filled with antiques and valuables, and transactions with people under investigation for fraud. Piece by piece, the image of my ex transformed from a charming, successful husband into a man teetering on the edge of exposure. Through it all, I remained calm, composed, almost cold. He tried everything. Angry outbursts, sweet apologies, manipulative promises. He told me I was overreacting, that I was destroying our family, that no one would believe me. But none of it pierced me anymore. Each word only reminded me why I had to see this through. One night, he cornered me in the living room. His voice low and menacing. "If you think you're going to win, you're wrong. I'll drag you through the mud. I'll make sure you regret ever crossing me." I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "I'm not crossing you. I'm stepping out of your shadow. There's a difference." That statement seemed to unnerve him more than any evidence could. He wasn't used to me standing tall, unafraid. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Meanwhile, Lily began to notice the changes too. Though I shielded her from the uglier details, she sensed my strength. One evening, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Mom, I don't know what's happening, but I know you're strong. You don't look sad anymore." Her words nearly broke me. Not because they hurt, but because they validated everything I was fighting for. I wasn't just building a case against him. I was building a new future for us. The day of the first court hearing arrived. I dressed deliberately, a navy blazer, crisp white blouse, hair pinned neatly. As I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the woman who once cried over unanswered texts and late nights. I saw a woman ready to face the man who thought he owned her silence. When we entered the courtroom, he wore the same smirk I'd seen in countless photographs. He believed he could charm the judge, manipulate the narrative, and paint me as hysterical. But as the evidence unfolded, the bank statements, the photos, the emails, I watched his confidence falter. For the first time, he realized the truth. I hadn't been crying in the shadows. I had been planning in the light. The days continued, and slowly the bitterness I once carried started to feel lighter. I didn't forget what had happened, nor did I excuse it, but I was starting to see the bigger picture. If Daniel hadn't betrayed me, I might have spent years clinging to something broken. Sometimes endings come disguised as heartbreak, but in reality they are a release. I began taking better care of myself, not out of spite for Daniel, but because I finally understood my worth. I went back to the gym and signed up for classes I'd always been too busy to attend when I was married. Dance, pottery, cooking, things that had nothing to do with proving myself to anyone but everything to do with rediscovering joy. On weekends I traveled. Short road trips at first, then longer ones. I visited cities I had only seen in passing and experienced them with wide eyes and an open heart. I started a journal where I documented everything. Not just the places I went, but how I felt, how I was healing, and what I was discovering about myself. It was during one of these trips that something inside me shifted completely. I was sitting at a cafe in another city sipping coffee, when I noticed a group of women laughing together at the next table. They weren't talking about relationships or heartbreak. They were talking about projects, business ideas, plans for the future. For the first time, I realized I had been living in the shadow of someone else's story, letting Daniel's actions define me. I didn't want that anymore. I wanted my own story. That was the moment I decided to take the next step. I began working on a business idea that had been sitting in the back of my mind for years. It was something I used to talk about, but Daniel never supported it. He always said things like, "That's too risky," or, "You should focus on what's practical." But what was practical about giving up on your dreams for someone who didn't value you? With the small savings I had, I started drafting my plan. I reached out to mentors, researched online, and joined communities of people with the same goals. I wasn't rich, I wasn't a genius, but I was determined. And determination can take you farther than anything else. The funny thing is, the more I focused on building my future, the less I thought about Daniel. He was no longer the center of my universe. He became just a character in my past, a lesson I had learned. But life has its own sense of humor. One day, I ran into Daniel at a mutual friend's event. I hadn't expected to see him, And I could tell by the look on his face that he hadn't expected me either. He looked different. Not in a good way. His shoulders slouched, his smile seemed forced, and though he tried to act confident, I could sense the unease in him. Standing across the room, I realized how much I had grown while he had stayed the same. When he finally came over, his words were awkward. "Hey, you look good," he said, forcing a grin. "Thanks," I replied politely. I wasn't rude, but I wasn't warm either. The power dynamic had shifted, and he knew it. We exchanged small talk, but it was clear that he wanted to say more. I could see it in his eyes, that hint of regret he was too proud to admit out loud. The old me might have wanted him to confess, to beg, to validate my pain. But the new me didn't need that. His regret, whether he admitted it or not, was not my responsibility. My life was no longer about him. As the evening ended, I walked away feeling lighter than I ever had before. That moment showed me that true power isn't in revenge or proving someone wrong. It's in living a life so full that their opinion no longer matters. And that's when the best part of my plan began to unfold. Because while he thought I'd spend my nights crying over him, I had spent my time building something incredible, something that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with me. And the best was yet to come. After that night, I realized I no longer wanted to measure my growth by whether or not Daniel regretted his choices. I wanted to measure it by the dreams I had once tucked away and was now bringing to life. The business idea I had been working on started as a spark, small, uncertain, and fragile. But as I poured myself into it, the spark grew into a flame. I had always been passionate about wellness and self-care. During my marriage, I often dreamed about creating a space where people, especially women, could focus on their healing and strength. Daniel had dismissed it as unrealistic, but I could see it clearly in my mind. So I began with workshops. Nothing too fancy, just a rented room, a handful of attendees, and lessons I had learned through my own journey. I shared about self-discovery, resilience, and rebuilding after heartbreak. People connected to it more than I imagined. They saw themselves in my story, and it gave them hope. The word spread faster than I expected. Within months, I had more women signing up, asking for more classes, requesting resources. I realized this wasn't just a side project. It had the potential to become something bigger. So I officially registered my business and gave it a name that symbolized rebirth and strength. Every single day I worked hard. I invested my time, my creativity, and my heart into building a community. Slowly, partnerships began forming. Local organizations reached out to collaborate, wellness coaches wanted to contribute, and before I knew it, I was hosting events with hundreds of people. And the most surprising part? The pain I once thought would consume me had transformed into fuel. The heartbreak became the very reason I was able to connect with others. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a bridge for others to walk across their own pain. Meanwhile, Daniel's presence in my life grew smaller and smaller. I didn't block him, but I didn't check in either. Occasionally, his name would pop up through friends or social media, and every time I noticed something, his life looked stagnant. While I was expanding, he seemed stuck. But the truth is, I didn't even care to compare anymore. I wasn't building my life to outshine him. I was building it because I finally saw my worth, and I refused to settle for less than what I deserved. Months passed, and my business continued to grow. I was invited to speak at a women's conference, and it was one of the most surreal moments of my life. Standing on stage, looking out at hundreds of faces eager to listen, I realized how far I had come. And it hit me, this was my something better. Not revenge, not bitterness, not making him jealous. My plan was never about him. It was about creating a life so fulfilling that no heartbreak could ever dim its light. But as fate would have it, life had one last surprise in store. After the conference, as I mingled with attendees, I saw him. Daniel. He hadn't been invited, of course. He was just there because someone he knew was part of the event. The moment he spotted me on stage earlier, I knew he had felt it. That realization that he had underestimated me. When our eyes met, I felt no anger, no sadness, just clarity. He walked over slower this time with a look that wasn't arrogant or smug, but almost humbled. "Wow," he said softly, his voice lacking the bravado it once carried. "I didn't expect this." I smiled, not out of spite, but from genuine peace. "Well, sometimes life gives us exactly what we need, not what we expect," I replied. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "You look happy. Really happy." "I am," I said simply. And it was the truth. We didn't talk much more after that. He left, fading into the crowd while I stayed, surrounded by people who believed in me, supported me, and celebrated me. For the first time, I realized how different my life had become. And in that moment, I silently thanked him. Not for the betrayal, not for the pain, but for pushing me out of a life that wasn't meant for me. Because if he hadn't thought I would crumble, I might never have discovered just how strong I truly was. That night, I went home and wrote in my journal. My ex thought I'd cry over him. Instead, I turned those tears into power. And my power built something beautiful. That was the truth. That was my victory. And it was better than anything I had ever planned. Life after that encounter with Daniel took on a different tone. Not because of him, but because of me. That moment of facing him again showed me how much I had changed. I no longer saw myself as the woman who had been abandoned, betrayed, or underestimated. I saw myself as the woman who had survived, grown, and created something meaningful from the ashes. My wellness business continued to expand. What started as workshops turned into a center with dedicated spaces for yoga, meditation, and counseling. Women from different backgrounds joined, and each one carried her own story of pain and recovery. We weren't just a community anymore. We were a family. I had been invited to do radio interviews, podcasts, and even a small TV segment. Each time I told the truth, not to bash Daniel or dwell on betrayal, but to show others that heartbreak doesn't define us unless we let it. That kind of honesty resonated with people. And yet, amidst all the noise of success, I found myself craving balance. I wanted to live, not just work. So I made time for travel, for friendships, for quiet evenings. I started painting again, a hobby I had abandoned years ago because Daniel thought it was a waste of time. With each brushstroke, I felt pieces of myself returning. One summer evening, while attending a networking dinner for local entrepreneurs, I met someone new. His name was Michael, and he was nothing like Daniel. He was kind without agenda, supportive without condescension, and genuinely interested in listening rather than speaking over me. He was about my age, had gone through his own heartbreak years before, and understood the value of rebuilding. We started with coffee, then dinners, and slowly, companionship blossomed into something deeper. For the first time in a long time, I experienced love without fear. Michael didn't try to overshadow my dreams, he encouraged them. He didn't question my strength, he admired it. But let me be clear. Michael wasn't the reason I healed. He wasn't my savior. I was my own savior. What he became was a partner in a journey I had already begun. A reminder that love could exist without pain or compromise of self. As months turned into a year, my life looked nothing like it had when I cried on the kitchen floor, believing Daniel had destroyed me. I had a thriving business, meaningful relationships, personal peace, and a love that respected me. One evening, I hosted a gala for my wellness center. It was a celebration of how far we had come. Hundreds of women gathered, sharing stories of resilience, growth, and success. As I stood on stage, thanking everyone for believing in the mission, I felt a lump in my throat. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. Gratitude that life had forced me to break. Gratitude that I hadn't stayed down. Gratitude that my ex's betrayal became the catalyst for the best version of myself. After the event, as I walked through the city lights with Michael by my side, he squeezed my hand and said, "You know, you're an inspiration. Not just to them, but to me too." I smiled, leaning into the moment. My ex thought I would cry over him, I said softly, almost to myself. But instead I planned something better. And all of this is that plan. Michael kissed my forehead, and in that instant, I knew I had closed the chapter of Daniel completely. Not with bitterness, not with revenge, but with victory. Because the truth is, revenge isn't always about seeing someone else fail. Sometimes the greatest revenge is living so fully, so joyfully, that the person who hurt you fades into irrelevance. And that's exactly what happened. Daniel was no longer a shadow in my life. He was just a memory. One that had led me to rediscover my strength, my purpose, and my happiness. By the time I got home that night, I didn't feel the need to write in my journal anymore. I didn't need to remind myself of how far I had come, because I was living it, breathing it every single day. That was my victory. That was my story. and it was so much better than tears. The next chapter of my life wasn't about Daniel at all, it was about me. And that's when I realized the most important truth of all. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting the past, it means refusing to let it control you. Months passed, and my wellness center expanded into a second location. I was invited to speak at conferences, and women reached out from across the country to share how my story gave them courage. It was surreal, honestly. Who would have thought that the woman who once cried herself to sleep over a cheating ex-husband would now be standing on stages, teaching others how to rebuild their lives? One day, I received an email from Daniel. The subject line was simple: "Can we talk?" For a moment, I just stared at the screen. Part of me laughed at the irony. He was reaching out to me now, after everything. But another part of me felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no longing. Just indifference. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The message was short. He wrote that he had seen my name in an article about successful entrepreneurs, and that he was proud of me. He even suggested we catch up sometime. I sat back in my chair, shaking my head. Not in anger, but in disbelief. The audacity of a man who once thought I was disposable now trying to re-enter my life as if nothing had happened. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any words I could have written. He had his chance and he lost it. The chapter had been closed, sealed, and archived. That night, I sat with Michael on our porch, sipping tea while the sun dipped below the horizon. I told him about the email, and he looked at me with that calm, steady gaze I loved. "What did you say back?" he asked. "Nothing," I replied. "There's nothing left to say." Michael smiled. "That's when you know you've truly moved on." And he was right. The funny thing about pain is that it doesn't last forever if you don't hold on to it. The tears I once shed over Daniel had dried long ago, replaced by laughter, joy, and a life I built with my own two hands. One evening, while preparing for another gala, I stood in front of the mirror wearing a gown that shimmered under the lights. My reflection looked back at me, confident, radiant, and unrecognizable compared to the woman Daniel left behind. For the first time, I truly saw myself not as a victim of betrayal, but as the author of my own story. When I walked onto the stage that night, I told the audience something I hadn't planned. I put down my notes, looked into the crowd, and spoke from my heart. I once thought my life ended when my ex betrayed me. I thought I would cry forever. But then I realized that every ending is just a chance to write a better beginning. My ex thought I'd cry over him, but instead I built something better. And if I could do it, so can you. The applause that followed wasn't just for me. It was for everyone in that room who had suffered, endured, and found a way to rise again. That night, as I danced with Michael and laughed with friends, I finally understood the real victory. It wasn't the success, the applause, or even the revenge. It was the peace I felt inside. The quiet strength that no betrayal could ever take away again. Daniel was just a chapter. But I was the whole book. And my story? It was only just beginning.